This week, we are talking monthly trade data, this month's jobs report, and another down week for cattle. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update on Brownfield. I'm your host, Meghan Grebner. With us to talk all things markets is University of Missouri, Scott Brown. How are you, sir?
I am good, Megan.
We'll talk and we'll dig into some of the details for this week's report. We'll preview next week's supply and demand numbers coming up. But first, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, starting on the cattle side this week, live fed cattle were basically down $2.20 this week. Those feeder cattle markets were steady to $3 lower on the week. And on the futures side, the August live cattle futures contract was down $1.05. And the August feeder cattle contract was down $1.60. We did see choice box beef higher this week, up $2.80. Loins and ribs really led the way in terms of higher choice box beef cutout. If we look at on the hog side, cash barrels and gilts were down 25 cents this week. The July lean hog futures contract was down $3.60, and we lost $1.80 on the pork cutout value. We were down across the board in all those components in the pork cutout value.
We continue to see that box beef find some strength. Is that a lot of seasonality? Is it just because it's kind of time for it to push back higher, or is it a combination of them both?
Yeah, I was going to say, so certainly seasonally, we'd expect to be seeing some strength. We might be expecting some of that seasonal strength to start to wane a little bit as we've gotten further into barbecue season here. And so I think fundamentally, are we going to see some strength at these higher prices continue? Maybe that's what's going to be needed to see higher cattle prices as we get into the second half of this year.
All right, let's take a look at slaughter numbers and run down this week for both cattle and hogs.
Yeah, we certainly came back from what was the holiday shortened week last week. USDA says for the week ending June 8th, a run of 614,000 head of cattle this week. That's up 74,000 head from the lower level of last week, but 3,000 head less than where we were a year ago. And on the hog side, a run of 2.422 million head this week. That's 267,000 head more than last week and 67,000 head more than where we were a year ago.
And then let's talk about how we're looking in that year-to-date comparison.
Yeah, on the cattle side, down 4.4% year to date, whereas on the hog side, up 0.8% year to date.
All right, the big report this week in terms of beef and pork, monthly trade data came out for the month of April. So let's talk a little bit about beef first, and then we can get into pork.
Yeah, so if we look at April beef exports, get the right month here today, it was 260 million pounds of beef that left the United States in April of 2024. That was down 8 million pounds from where we were April of 23. However, we are talking about slightly higher beef exports in April of this year relative to what we did in March. And if you remember March, we were down really hard in terms of beef exports. So I think a little better news when we look at what's been happening as we've moved through 2024. South Korea down 13.5 million pounds, I think was really a big part of that. Mexico was actually up 8 million pounds in terms of trade on beef with Mexico. So important. We talk about Mexico all the time on the pork side of the equation, but getting a little strength on the beef side was helpful as well. When you look at year to date, right at 1 billion pounds of beef has left the United States. That is down a little more than 5% year to date. On the pork export side, lots of good news, I think, on pork exports. We were at 656 million pounds of pork exports, some pretty phenomenal growth, up 75 million pounds relative to what we did in April of 2023. Strong growth relative to what we did in March of 24. We were at 620 in March of 24, and now we're sitting here at 656. So a nice gain. Of course, Mexico is really important to that number. Up 57 of the 75 million pound increase was Mexico. South Korea was up 16 million pounds. Those all others were still up. All of the countries that we don't talk about so specifically up 18 million pounds. And the really outlier on the downside was China, that was down 21 million pounds.
We can talk about exports, but we can't talk about them without also talking, especially on the beef side, about imports. We touched on this a little bit last week as well. Imports are much higher than they were a year ago.
That's right. I don't think it was too far a stretch to say we might be talking about record beef imports here in 2024. USDA tells us we imported 327 million pounds of beef in April of this year. That's up 32 million pounds. So when you think about what happened in net, net down about 40 million pounds between lower exports and higher imports. It helps balance what was shorter supplies. So when we look at the combination, all right, so we've imported 1.5 billion pounds of beef thus far in 2024. Compare that to our billion pounds of exports. Imports up 22% year to date.
And again, I think it's a good reminder to talk about what we're importing and what it's being used for and why we have to supplement our production in the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. So this cuts both ways, right, Meghan? And we talk about this a lot. We're tending to bring in lean ground beef to mix with, extra fat that we're going to have from what's been heavier carcasses here in 2024. So there's pluses and minuses to this whole discussion about imports of beef at this point. I know, folks will have strong opinions one way or the other about whether it's good or bad, but it is important to recognize all beef's not the same, right? So this is a case where trying to keep maybe ground beef prices a little bit lower by bringing in some lean beef has been helpful, especially for consumers facing some near record prices, if not record prices, for some of these beef products.
All right. Jobs report also out this week, and kind of interesting when you look at the jobs and also taking into consideration the unemployment rate.
Yeah, that's correct. So we got more jobs than we thought, but we also saw unemployment go up. When we look at those numbers a little bit in more detail, so economists pre-report were expecting 185,000 jobs to be added in May, and we blew by that and added 272,000 jobs according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So much stronger job growth. Of course, that then has the concern about inflation associated with it, as some were hoping a slowdown in job growth would help push inflation lower. Yet at the same time, unemployment, according to the survey, was increased to 4%. I think we also saw a few more folks that had been out of the job market back in looking for employment at this week or at this month. So when you look at where did we see increases, healthcare, government employment was up, and also leisure and hospitality was also strong. I think when you see all of the Memorial Day travel that seemed to be happening in this country, it's not surprising to see that growth in the leisure and hospitality side.
I would assume, too, that maybe provide some benefits in terms of job growth and as we think about being able, so the service industry just in general, restaurants, hotels, resorts, those types of things, being able to serve customers fully.
So absolutely. I think that is, one of the benefits that we see. And again, the whole better jobs report than we expected, although has potential inflationary impacts. It's more money in consumers' pockets on average than otherwise would have been the case. Perhaps some of that those additional dollars go for beef and pork purchases.
All right. This coming week, we have retail prices, supply and demand, consumer sentiment. as you're looking specifically retail prices first and then supply and demand, what are some of the things you're looking for?
So I think on the retail prices side, it'll be much more focus on just where beef retail prices are according to the survey. Are we going to continue to see them push higher, and just what are we really putting in front of consumers in terms of prices for those beef products? On the WASI side, we're still a little too early yet to get too excited about what crop we're going to put in the bin yet. USDA doesn't give us anything other than trend yields at this point on the crop side of the equation. We got our first look at 2025 projections from them, seeing what kind of modifications they might make this month might be the most interesting piece of that. And then for me, consumer sentiment, trying to weigh all this, more jobs, inflation might be an issue. When's the Fed potentially lower interest rates? How's the election presidential election play into all of this? What's the sentiment of consumers? I think that demand side will continue to be interesting as we look next week.
Scott, it's always great to see you. We'll talk to you next Friday.
Sounds good, Megan.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, go to brownfieldagnews.com. You can also submit questions and comments. And for a daily rundown of what's happening in the market, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute, both a preview in the morning and close at the end of the day. Have a great weekend. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.